Hey everybody, welcome to the first video for Anatomy Physiology 1 for Lecture 1, and this is in Unit 1 and Module 1. So I'm just going to go over a brief introduction to these PowerPoints. You all know how to read. If you go back and look at the link that's on the course content page titled Helpful Hints, it'll kind of give you an overview of what I use to succeed in doing these sorts of things, and what I feel is one of the better ways to organize and maintain the content that you find on this site and in future courses. So I'm just going to use this as kind of like a helpful video for you to kind of hear what I'm saying, kind of hear a couple extra things. We'll of course be able to go over all this stuff in class as well. We just want you to be able to hear my voice when we're talking about these things. Some people are audio learners, and that helps more than visual learners. And this being an online class, it can be kind of difficult in that format to grasp some of the concepts that are in this. So let's go ahead and get started here. And we'll just roll through this as it pulls up. So the basic structure of all of these module videos and all these module lectures will be kind of the same here. I'll go through with a little introductory slide there, and then it'll come to this one. It'll give you kind of the name of what's going on. It'll give you the module number if you look here, and then kind of the title of it, and then some learning outcomes, what I'm hoping that you're going to pick up from this, and that's kind of relate to the study guides as we get towards the end of the unit in preparation for the exam. So let's go through this here. And what exactly are we learning in this unit and in this course overall? First, we have to make the distinction of what actually is anatomy and physiology. So anatomy describes the structures of the body, basically what it's made of, where the stuff's located, what are the relationships between these structures. The term itself means the cutting open. Like I said, it's the study of the internal and external structures of the body. And it can be divided into a couple of different categories: gross anatomy, microscopic anatomy. This gives you a little bit of an overview of gross and microscopic anatomy. Gross meaning the larger aspect. So if you're looking at, say you're looking at your pay stub from work and you see two terms, you see gross and net pay. Gross is what you're making overall, but net's actually what you're bringing home. So gross just means the large quantity in its entirety. And then obviously we should all know what microscopic means at this point. That just means what we can't see with the naked eye, and it's going to deal with a lot of structures that are on the inside that make up this gross anatomy. Again, this gives you the comparison between gross and microscopic. And then physiology is a little bit different. It's the study of the functions and relationships of these anatomical structures. Basically includes their individual and cooperative functions, and it basically tries to explain the physical and chemical mechanisms that are responsible for the the origin, development, and the progression of life. Basically, what are the processes that make these things happen? Why do they happen? Not necessarily the name of the specific structure, but how does that structure work? What are the overall functions that it provides? And these two things are linked together. Anatomy leads to physiology, and then physiology leads to anatomy. Basically, we know that what a kidney does, and where it is, and that would be our anatomy, but its actual renal function would fall into the physiology category. And then its physiology category might lead to changes in our anatomy. So these things are interrelated. For example, cells in the alveoli of the lungs are simple squamous epithelium, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. Basically, one flat layer allows for gas exchange, and the gas exchange, the process that happens there, would be your physiology function of that. And then skin cells are stratified squamous epithelium. It's going to be your anatomy portion, but there are interrelationships between them, having multiple thick layers that allow for protection. That's going to be the physiology function of them. The glands that are involved in that, the chemicals that are released, the relationship between temperature regulation, also known as thermoregulation, and how those skin cells interact with the outside environment. As we're going through this, we're going to talk about different levels of organizations which help to identify and transition from that gross anatomical structure to that microscopic anatomical structure. This will be on the test. I would strongly encourage you to know the specific order and what I ask for. Make sure that you pay attention in the questioning, whether I ask you to go from most general to most specific, or in some form of that. If I'm asking for general, that means the larger gross anatomy, specific meaning the smallest, most complex organism. You can see a hierarchy here in this little pyramid, but basically what I need you to know is, as we go through it from most general to most specific, is that organisms are composed of organ systems, organ system composed of organs, organs composed of tissues, tissues composed of cells, cells contain organelles, organelles are composed of molecules, and then molecules are composed of atoms, and that will be a test question. All of these organ systems are interrelated. You can see the 11 different ones projected here. But a lot of the structures that are found in these organ systems can be found in other organ systems as well. So they're not specific to these general systems. Just know that most often this is where we're going to classify them. But kidney can be in the excretory system as well as the urinary system, as well as different things. You don't find urinary here, but it's a part of the excretory. But a lot of things lead to a lot of different things. All of these things are interrelated to make you work and produce life. You'll go through a couple of these here, your lymphatic system, your respiratory system, and you can read this. You don't need me to do that for you. The muscular system, the nervous system, your integumentary system, which is essentially your skin, your skeletal system, endocrine, cardiovascular, digestive system, urinary system, and your reproductive system. And we'll go through several of those in this class. What separates Anatomy 1 from Anatomy 2 is not necessarily complexity and building on Anatomy 1. Anatomy 1 covers certain systems of the body, Anatomy 2 covers other systems. So it's just basically a continuation of the ideas, not necessarily a different level of complexity in them. I also wanted to give you some of the characteristics of living organisms because it's important for you to know what actually constitutes a living organism. And you can kind of get into this debate when you start to classify, say, bacteria and viruses, for those of you who've taken microbiology. I know a lot of you are thinking, well, it's pretty easy to see if something is alive, but some things have these characteristics, some things don't, but you can read all of those here. One of the key concepts that we're going to focus on in specifically physiology itself is the concept of homeostasis, and I can't overstate the importance here. It's what drives most of the physiological functions in your body, and basically maintaining homeostasis, like I said, is absolutely vital to the organism's survival. If you do not maintain homeostasis, eventually it's going to lead to illness or death. Certain things are going to lead to those faster than others. Sometimes you're just not right, but in other times, say your pH levels in your body, if those increase or decrease beyond a certain extent, you're going to start to denature proteins, and it's eventually going to lead to your death. But homeostatic regulation is an adjustment of the physiological systems to preserve homeostasis in the environments, and it's often inconsistent, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous, which is what medicine is built off of, is technically regulating that homeostatic balance, getting you back to equilibrium. And systems respond to that external and internal changes to function within a normal range. Body temperature, fluid balance, all of these different things go into homeostatic balance. And homeostasis, the term itself just means the middle. Homeo meaning same, and stasis meaning state. You can look on the site. I've given you a handout that talks about some of the key prefixes and suffixes that you'll find in science. One of the things that makes science hard, a reason a lot of students have a lot of trouble with it, is because it's almost like learning a different language. And anatomy and physiology is a tough one to do. There's a lot of terminology in this course, so it can make it difficult to remember what all of these things are. But if you can learn those prefixes, if you can learn those suffixes, if you can learn the Greek and Latin root words for all of these things, it might make it a little bit easier to say, oh, well, I know renal is referring to the kidneys, so it's got to be something with kidneys. And what do the kidneys do? And then that can help you to answer some of the questions as you move forward. But bottom line, essentially all organs and tissues in the body perform functions that help to maintain these constant states. And an example, the lungs are going to provide oxygen to the extracellular fluids to replenish oxygen used by the cells. And so you'll have your respiratory homeostatic balances there. The kidneys, as we mentioned before, maintain constant ion concentrations, whether that making you pee more, making you thirsty, all of those physiological things are going to be reflective in the homeostatic balance that the renal system is going to facilitate. Again, you can see kind of a graphic here that causes some physiological changes in response to a stimuli. You'll have three parts of the homeostatic system. Usually you have a receptor, which is going to receive your stimulus, whatever that may be, the control center that's going to process that signal and send the instructions to an effector that's actually going to carry out those instructions. So the example I have lifted over here to the right is conditions that will cause your body temperature to rise. And so what's the stimulus, which we didn't go over here, but the stimulus would be changes in body temperature. Your receptor is going to be thermoreceptors that are somewhere in the body. Let's say, for example, skin. Your skin's going to be able to detect changes in temperature. If it's internal, your hypothalamus is going to compare that against a set point, and in your body, normal physiological temperature is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere around 37 degrees Celsius. Obviously, if any of you are in medicine, you know that not everybody's temperature is going to be 98.6. There are varying degrees of which acceptable things are. We normally use ranges in medicine versus exact points because not everybody's body is the same. And then there's a couple ways that the hypothalamus is going to send signal out. So it's going to send a signal out to the sweat glands to maybe increase sweat production, to help evaporation from the skin, to help cool the skin off. It might cause your blood vessels to dilate, which will help lower the temperature, and overall your body temperature is going to decrease. Though that decrease in body temperature is again going to be another stimulus that the thermoreceptors are going to pick up and then tell the hypothalamus, once that signal gets there, that, hey, we've had enough of this signal, stop. So these are some ways that the homeostatic balance is maintained. Again, that's just another graphic of what I was just talking about there. That leads us into a big concept in this unit, and what your case study readings are going to be on are negative and positive feedback. We just described a negative feedback mechanism. Basically, negative feedback is your body senses a change and activates a mechanism to reverse or negate the stimulus. Basically, you had a stimulus and you want to get back to wherever you were. So whatever the stimulus may be, positive or negative, it is a deviation from the normal homeostatic range and normal physiological range. And so your body releases a signal either to increase the production of something or to decrease the production of something. Over here on the right, you see a graphic for the homeostatic balance of blood calcium levels. You'll see that when we get into the muscular categories and the endocrine categories. Specifically, the example here talks about your parathyroid glands releasing PTH in response to overproduction of calcium, which then your thyroid will release calcitonin to help reduce the levels of calcium in your bloodstream. I listed a couple examples over here to the left as well. The regulation of blood glucose, which is important. For those of you who have any familiarity with diabetes, that's essentially the entire disease in a nutshell there. We already talked about how it regulates body temperature, and believe it or not, most physiologic mechanisms are part of the negative feedback response. So I kind of highlighted it when I was just talking about it there, but does negative really mean negative? When we hear the word negative, we tend to mean bad or in a downward direction. But what we're talking about here with negative feedback is any homeostatic process that actually changes the direction of the stimulus is considered a negative feedback loop. So it may either increase or decrease the stimulus, but the stimulus is not allowed to continue as it did before. As I previously mentioned, we can talk about an increase in a level or a decrease in the level. And what a negative feedback system is do is respond to that increase or respond to that decrease to either increase or decrease the physiologic process to get whatever it may be back to that homeostatic balance. So for example, here again, we go over the blood glucose levels. That might be important. Excuse me. And in the example here over to the right, while it may appear positive, considering it's an increase in blood glucose, it causes the release of insulin. It's still a negative feedback loop, but it's not in the typical direction that we would use the term negative. Excuse me, I'm sorry. The positive feedback mechanism is different. So a positive feedback intensifies the change in the body's physiological condition rather than reversing it. So instead of seeing an increase and then a physiological symptom causing a decrease, or seeing a decrease in something that causes an increase, in a positive feedback system, you're going to see an increase of something, which in turn is going to release another increase of something. So you're going to go up, and then you're going to continue to go up, or you're going to go down, and then continue to go down. The big positive feedback mechanism, the big example in anatomy and physiology is childbirth. Because in childbirth, the brain is going to stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin, which is going to be carried by the bloodstream to the uterus, which is going to increase the frequency of uterine contractions. Basically, the uterus's way, for those of you who aren't familiar with how childbirth works, basically that's the uterus' way to say, hey, let's get this kid out of here. As the head starts to push against the cervix, it's going to have nerve impulses in the cervix that will then send a signal back to the brain that say, okay, here we go. It's time to push this kid out. Let's continue to increase those oxytocin levels. Let's increase that signal, and let's get this kid out of here because it's time to go. And that's important in a lot of things. One, if you're married or you know somebody who's ever had a baby, I guarantee you they want that kid out of there as soon as possible. But it also serves other purposes, in the sense that there can be some infection control issues the longer the baby stays in the uterus after the water breaks and things like that. So it's more conducive for the body that once that baby's ready to go, once that birthing process starts, that they get it out as soon as possible, because it increases the odds of survival. It decreases the mortality rate of the infant at that point. I would keep in mind that the positive feedback loops are normal, but are activated only when needed. So seeing a positive feedback loop, it's not something you should be alarmed at, but it's not something that occurs in everyday homeostatic balance. As I said previously, most of these feedback loops you're going to see are going to be negative feedback, but there's some specific examples like childbirth or blood loss or things like that that are going to be a positive feedback. So that includes the lecture video for Module 1.1.